And they thought that was a shame because he had done so much for Judson and Brown. For Edward Judson, he got him a job as the auditor of building the Sunnyside Ditch, kind of the hiring fireman. And then for Frank Brown, he got him a job as a teacher in San Mateo Canyon School because in 1879 there weren't any schools in Redlands area, except for Mission School that had been around since 1853, but it wasn't going to be in the Redlands area. Okay, so they owed a lot to this guy, Myron Krause. He loaned him $6,000. He gave to help start Redlands. He also gave Frank Brown the job of surveying the building of the Crafton Reservoir, which is still being used by the Crafton Water Company to this day, in 1882. And he was always very helpful. Okay, Myron Krause was the deacon for the Congregational Church. He got Judson and Brown to donate the land for the first Congregational Church that was on the corner of Church Street and the Terrace in 1883. And so they really felt they owed something to this man who had died in 1886 of pneumonia, besides being, you know, planted next to the Crafton Hills. And so they had never thought about a cemetery. In 1886, there wasn't even a downtown Redlands. There was just 1,000 acres of land sold. People were planting grapes, and they had vineyards and apricots and peaches and plums, and only a few foolish people planted oranges. And those people planting oranges were doing the right thing, because that ended up being the money crop. Okay, so when Myron Krause died, the Judson Brown bought 23 acres up here in no man's land. This is truly a boot hill. Okay, had no water to irrigate up here, and as I said, sagebrush, lots of rattlesnakes, and that's about it. In fact, the railroad, when they sold the land, they sold it for $2.50 an acre because they considered it worthless. Now the land down where Redlands is, on Cajon Street, they sold that for $4 an acre. So you can see this is half as worth as the other. And so when they bought this land, they thought, well, at least we'll have a burial site for Myron Krause. Okay, and so we'll go by his grave site because he's the second person buried up here, along with a few other people who were disinterred, who were buried all over the place. Because the first cemetery in the county was at Agua-Monte. It's still there, south of Colton. And then, of course, the Pioneer Cemetery, 1850s in San Bernardino, has been around a long time. And then there are several cemeteries in San Mateo Canyon because there are actually settlements there going back to the 1840s. But they're really small cemeteries and stuff. In fact, they're not developed in any way. I'd have to point them out to you because you could drive right by them and not even notice them. Okay. So this cemetery, when it was built, or when it was finally established for 23 acres, it was the only cemetery really on the east end of the San Bernardino Valley. So if you died in Beaumont, Banning, Oak Glen, Forest Falls, Big Bear, Yucaipa, you ended up here, okay? And so Yucaipa has its own little section. And so little areas where each territory said, well, this is where we'll bury our people that are from our, because Yucaipa didn't have a cemetery. So I'll show you as we go through the different zones as you walk through. Also, ethnicity became part of it. Originally, all the plots were sold for $10, and they were 9 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. Now they're a little bit smaller than that, and they're not $10 anymore. And that $10, $5 went to the Cemetery Endowment Fund, which they started to help maintain the cemetery forever, and then $5 went to the cemetery superintendent, the person who dug the hole and buried you, and then $10 went to overall financing to buy more land in the future, to build mausoleums and things like that. So when this was thought of in 1928, it's because King Tutankhamun had been found in Egypt in 1922, and people in the United States went on the rage for King Tut stuff. He still, you know, he was on display down at the Reagan Library for 6 months. They advertised the heck out of it and stuff. So anything that was King Tut oriented became fashionable. So on my in my neighborhood on Buena Vista, the house next to me is the King Tut house. It has 2 sphinxes out front. It has a flat roof. It has a pond next to which is the Nile River, and it has, well, what are you gonna do? It's hard to get a pond, you know, hard to get the river over here. So and he's got reeds and stuff growing in that, and then inside the house it has all kinds of mantelpieces and stuff that shows Egyptian figurines and stuff. So when this was built in 1928, at the height of the rage, see the raven above the door? So that'd be typical of a pharaoh's grave that you find in Egypt, except they buried them. Okay, unless you're really important, Cheops and others, and you get a pyramid. All right, but civilization has always seemed to honor their dead by having elaborate graves and stuff. That's both a positive and a negative, because in graves that were all over Egypt, they've all been raided and all the artifacts stolen and stuff from them, and you're placed on display in some museum, and people look at you as you walk by, as they walk by. And of course, the earliest cemeteries in the United States, 1700s, 1600s, go back to Boston, and you will see how they're really not taken care of. I've been in Northern California and traveled through some of the cemeteries there, and it's god-awful. This is one of the last city-owned cemeteries, because cemeteries don't make money, okay? And basically what you're doing in the cemetery is selling real estate, and the real estate's one-time sale, and then guess what? You have to take care of the plot forever, and that's a long time, forever. And so one of the things you're not seeing cemeteries do any longer is build mausoleums. Right. 1928. All right, and you got to take care of that forever. And as a building, you know, it had 650 crypts inside, and they were pretty well filled up, you know, a couple of decades ago. And so now you still have it. It doesn't make any money, and all you have to do is keep, you know, maintaining and stuff. And so it's a huge responsibility. The cemetery itself hasn't always been taken care of well. The endowment fund was up to $2 million a couple of years ago, and that led to all the repaving that you see, and a new cemetery superintendent, and they fixed up the office, the 1922 buildings that are there. What this cemetery needs to be modern is a crematorium. And you're going, oh my God, Dachau, Auschwitz. Well, and guess what? 50% of everybody who dies in the United States is cremated today. Okay, that's the biggest thing, because, well, that real estate out there is expensive. And buy a casket for it, and on top of that, and you bury it, wow, you're going to get into a huge expense, okay, right on top of it. So, Native Americans, you know where their local cemeteries are?
On the reservation?
There aren't any, because they practiced cremation. Okay, they would dig a hole, not very deep, maybe 2 feet, put the body in, and build up all kinds of wood, if you could find it, and then light it on fire. That's into that. And so that's why you don't see any Native American cemeteries across the United States. And the Sioux Indians would just build a structure, place the body on top, and then you were food for the vultures and everything else. And then eventually not a hurricane, but a tornado or something come along and wipe you out, and that'd be the end of that. So the old saying is, remember thou art dust, and to dust thou shalt return. It's quite true. And it's probably a bad idea to be buried with your wedding rings or jewelry or anything else. That just makes you more tempting. Because who's to say 400 years from now what happens here? Will the city of Redlands still be taking care of this? You know, I just ask these questions because go back to Egypt and they probably said, well, this is, 4,000 years later, how are things going for those pharaohs?
Actually, being in a
Other than
museum
being
sounds pretty
visited,
well.
and that's about it,
Doesn't sound bad.
so it's kind of interesting. Let's go inside and see what life looks like in 1928. Well, not life anyway, but
I'm going to the book.
come on in. Keep coming in because there's still a crowd out there. Yes. Wow, no good football games today?
Nope.
Well, there are football games, and that's why we have more women. Oh.
58 to 17 or something like that.
Oh.
58 to 21 the last time.
Yeah.
To the state of
Oh, yeah, that was smart. Keep on coming in. We're almost all in. It's nice and cool in here, you notice that? So everything in here is original except for the chandelier. The original chandelier was very, very expensive, and somebody stole it in the 1980s. And it was elaborate. I have a photo that was taken in 1928 when the building was finished, and it shows the chandelier. And of course, they have the flowers decorating the whole interior, and it's really, really nice. But to replace that chandelier today is about $15,000. And about $3,000 of that is just shipping it from the East Coast back to here. So, originally planned was to spend $60,000 on this mausoleum. As I said, it would hold 650 crypts. And when they finished, it cost $70,000, okay? And that shouldn't surprise you, because anytime the government does anything, it always, they get the one bid. So what's the most expensive part of this mausoleum?
The marble.
The marble. The marble came from Alaska, and what I want you to see is, look at over here on my right over here, and on the left over here. Behind that looking bookcase, you'll see that they cut that slab in half exactly, and it's a mirror image on both sides. Yes. And to do that, and that had to come all the way from Alaska where it was polished there and then put together here. That had to come down in separate railroad cars because they couldn't have anything on top of it for fear they hit a bump and it cracked. Plus the floor is marble and the whole inside is marble and the front casings are all marble as well. So that's where a huge chunk of the money came from. And of course they made the building high to make, once again, keep it cooler inside here. Then they did some thematic things that are Redlands, okay? So if you look at the stained glass windows down here on that end, what is that depicting? that is going to be 200 years old in Redlands next year.
Wow.
Has Smiley Heights got a river going through it? No, that's where those are right. If you're a Sankey fan, we're going to charge you an extra $5. So that is facing east, and the Mill Creek Saw comes out of Mill Creek in the San Bernardino Mountains, and of course it's showing some of the mountain trees that you'd see along the course. But as it gets down to Redlands, of course, today it doesn't have any water flowing through it any longer. But the 200th anniversary we'll be celebrating next year. We're going to be doing bus tours of Mill Creek Saw and take you from Green Spot where it starts all the way down to Old San Bernardino between here and Loma Linda, which will be a treat. So now that you know what that is, what is that depicting down at the other end in the stained glass window?
Big Bear Lake.
Big Bear Lake. Nice guess, but it's right outside that window. Sunset. Cliff Street was renamed Sunset in 1925, and so Sunset went from Cliff Street, which was all along the edge of the cemetery, going all the way up to Panorama Point, and renamed Sunset. If you really want to get confused and get lost in Redlands, just take a drive on Sunset and look for a particular address. Okay? And make it challenging, like Sunset South, North, East. And because it goes in a circle, and oh my God, you can get really lost. And where they decided, the post office decided, okay, this is the beginning of the East and this is the beginning of the South, God only knows, because I've tried to figure it out and you can't figure it out. You really have to take a Redlands map with you or your GPS. And then it's somehow the GPS is smarter than all of us and has figured it out and where things are. So those are the two depictions, Sunset on one side and the Mill Creek Saw on the other. Of course, this is a religious scene behind us here. And they're slowly but surely repairing the stained glass. And when you get panels this big, it's very difficult to repair stained glass because you have to take out the whole section, number it all, and then put it back in piece by piece and resolder around the copper from beginning to end. And somebody's got a hole through a rock or something in the above section there. And so that'll have to be repaired. And as I said, when you build something like this and it costs $70,000 and you have to take care of it forever ends up being a long time. So, who ends up being buried up in this particular building? Because, you know, you're not down in the flatlands here. Here you've got a view. And you're up high, you're not on the ground. So, if you walk down, you'll see the Courtners are buried here. And they have their own funeral chapel in town. And the Bartletts are buried here because they own a funeral chapel. I'm sure they cut a deal with the cemetery superintendent, and it's not where you're buried, it's who you know. The other thing that's taking place here, they're doing some modernization on this because we want to get this back into use again. There's a lot of empty space, as you know. And for the most part, unless you have the key like me, you can't get in here most of the time. And so it's only by request that they hand out the key and they let people come in and go to see the exterior of the graves of their departed family members. There are, of course, little urns outside each one for flowers, and there's a few spaces open, and they're not really burying anybody now here in any of these crypts because when this is built in 1928, everybody was smaller, and so were the caskets. The caskets were smaller. And the new caskets don't fit in this building in 1928. Now, the 1958 mausoleum doesn't have a problem with physical size, and the addition that was made in 1972 doesn't have a problem with additional size, and they have plenty of spaces down there as well. But this really can't have any burials, or the typical burials with caskets, because you just can't get the casket inside. You'd have to have it specially built. to do it. So what's the plan here? If 50% of people now are being cremated, well, you see the new bookcase back here, and we're putting books in it. Andy, point out the books that are behind you. Those are ashes, folks. And see the books up here? Those are ashes, okay? Those are all ashes. And right down the center here will also be additional bookcases 6 feet high. And you can, once again, you can buy a whole case and get your whole family in there at about 3 feet by 3 feet, depending on, well, if you're Catholics or Mormons, you got more. You need more space, okay? But it's a whole lot cheaper for burial. And they're also setting up sections where you can also buy a bench. The bench is hollowed out and there's drawers in it. And once again, with a lock on each one. And the ashes can go in the bench. And you buy the bench and you keep the bench. And as long as members of your family are dying, you keep adding their ashes to the bench. Picnic tables, all kinds of different things are being added. But as I said, what the cemetery needs to be competitive, because you are competing with other cemeteries in the area. Redlands has no crematorium. This site needs a crematorium, okay? And now you don't have a puffing smokestack with people's ashes coming out on the top or anything like that. Everything now is done now. You're burned with natural gas, and it's over in a jiffy, about 2 hours. So while somebody's out mowing the lawn, you can also have the crematorium going, and no one's the wiser. And then you sweep up the ashes, put them into whatever container the family has purchased, and you can take them home, or you can take them down the ocean and dump them into Newport Beach off the pier or anywhere. Except it's illegal in most places just to dump ashes. But who knows about the law? And then the other thing is that the cemetery has to have the ash container, if it's buried, has to be in a concrete vault. It may be only 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet high, but it has to be in there because that state law requires that. So many people who own real estate out there and a loved one is buried are simply burying the urns above the original burial and then changing the stone out front and chiseling in the additional names. And that's also very possible. The cemetery has 30,000 burials, and you could easily do 30,000 more because there's still all the vacant land they bought in 1961. It goes from here to the Burridge House, the back end of the Burridge House. And you can see that. Lots of people who came to Redlands came here to recover their health and came too late. They had tuberculosis, or what was called then consumption. And so many arrived in the train and died before they got off the train. And they had no driver's license in 1890, and they had no means of identification, and they ended up in the pauper section of our graveyard. Well, the Friends of Hillside Cemetery, along with the Redlands Historical Society and other groups, gave money, and the last time the cemetery was improved, the irrigation system added so that now Pauper's cemetery area now has green lawn over it. Most of the original burials that are there had wooden crosses. Well, they rotted away years ago, and no one we know who's buried in each area, but there's no plaque or anything else across the top of the grave and stuff. So it's down in one of the valleys. I'll point it out when we're on the tour, but it's now been greened in. Unless I had told you, you wouldn't even know there's a paupers area here. So if you died without any money at all, the city put on the expense of burying you, but you didn't get a fancy gravestone or anything like that. You just were put in the ground, not even in a casket, folks. You understand that most countries in the world do not go to the expense of building a casket, especially an iron casket, to put it in the ground and bury it. That's only rich people can afford to do that. I mean, you're there with the Egyptians and stuff. Plus, usually you're buried with your wedding ring and everything else, which I said is a major temptation for the people in the future to grave rob. Because how often do they have guards here at the cemetery at night? 0. Okay, so when this was stolen, we don't know when it happened. They know the year in which it happened, but we don't know who got it. And they've looked forever to see if it came up on eBay or anything else, and nothing has ever come up. So this chandelier is a very humble replacement to the original that was here. Now, if you look on the wall over here is a plaque. 100 years ago today, 2 Redlanders died in World War I. They were at Camp Lewis and they died of pneumonia. I'd say one died of pneumonia and one died of Spanish flu. You'll also see a woman's name on there. She died of Spanish flu in France, and she was a nurse. And so everyone who died in World War I, that plaque was to commemorate their participation in World War I. The cemetery here has a section for just military. I should say military can be buried there, okay? And on Veterans Day, the circle has a flagpole and everything else, and they have a speaker, a podium, a microphone, and everything else, and they come out and commemorate Veterans Day around that circle, because we have people who died. Well, we have 161 Civil War veterans buried at Hillside. Plus we have from the Indian Wars that are buried here. And of course World War I, World War II. By the time we get to World War I, you could ask to have the body of the slain soldier shipped back to the United States. And so quite a few families did that, okay? This last July, I went along with my wife and Don McHugh and 30 other people from A.K. Smiley Library on a tour of World War I and World War II sites in France. And we went to the sites where some of these gentlemen died. And it was really cool. We had a little Redlands flag and a little American flag we put on either side of their gravestones, and said a few nice words about their participation in World War I, and then went on to other sites. And so we went to about half of the names that are on that. The other half, one person was at Fort Benning, and he was diving into a stream, and he thought that the stream was 6, 7 feet deep. He was 6 inches deep. He broke his neck, and so his name is also on there. So you would think, you know, probably the most famous Redlander name on there is Ben Berry. Can you see Ben Berry's name up there? Okay, Ben Berry graduated Redlands High School, and he went to war, of course, in 1917. He was on the 1916 track team. He held the United States record for the high school mile. Okay, but unfortunately he couldn't run faster than German machine gun bullets crossing no man's land at Chateau Thierry. We also had another Redlander who was in the Lost Battalion. They got encircled by Germans and finally were rescued towards the end of the war. They finally got out and stuff. Several Redlanders got to know Sergeant York. Remember the man who captured 132 Germans in a single day by himself? He had shot a number of Germans. He grew up in Tennessee, and he was shooting squirrels to make, for food. And so if you can shoot a squirrel at 200 yards, you can shoot a German at 200 yards too. And so he was doing that, and the Germans didn't know how many people were killing him. They just knew that they were dropping dead in this one trench, and so they all marched out together, dropped their guns, and they're surrounded by one. It was towards the end of the war when the Germans were ready to give up anyway, and they wanted to surrender. They wanted to surrender to the American side because food, clothing, shelter was all provided. Plus you could get the worst thing in the trenches off of you, cooties, lice. You're literally crawling with lice because those trenches were wet all winter long and cold, and in the summer it was hot in blazes, and anything to get out of the trench and be surrendered at the end of the war. The Germans at the end of World War I were eating rats and anything else that would wander into the trenches because they were hard up. Our country had basically blockaded German ports, and they weren't getting any food in. And of course, all the men were out fighting the war, who's growing the food that you're going to eat? So there just wasn't anything left. So anyway, that had been placed in the original City Hall, and when the City Hall burned down in 1939, that was placed in the mausoleum here because this is built in 28. So they brought it up here and put it on the inside. We do have a commemoration for World War II and the Vietnam War, and that's down on the Veterans Memorial that's outside Jenny Davis Park at Redlands Boulevard and New York Street. If you've never been there, it's got the eternal flame going. It's worthwhile to come up and just look at the names. I see classmates' names who went to Vietnam and didn't come back. So it's kind of creepy, you know, in the sense that here I am giving you a tour and they've been gone since 1969. So, all right, any questions about this building?
Tom, you know who was the first interred here?
No, I don't know. The cemetery would have that in their records.
Because I see Arthur Gregory up there.
Yeah, Arthur Gregory. When you say Arthur Gregory, you got to say which one. There's the Arthur Gregory whose name is attached to Lake Gregory. There's the Arthur Gregory who built the La Posada Hotel, and those are two different Arthur Gregories. And there's another Arthur Gregory today that's a descendant of the original Arthur Gregory. Okay, go outside. I'm going to lock this door.
So I guess yeah. Nice.
No, mostly Los Angeles. We didn't have any local stained glass artisans here. We do today, but we didn't then. But the themes were chosen by the cemetery superintendent and the city council. Maybe Los Angeles. Well, he's going to be a speaker. We have a week's speaker at
It is
the
matched.
Historical
I
Society meeting
didn't
on
notice
Monday.
that before. This side and that.
Thank you. Okay, unless you want to be part of the flag.
Oh my gosh.
A lot more people showed up.
Yeah, wow, it's a huge turnout.
Yeah. I don't know how big their society is.
Small,
Is it?
I think, yeah.
You're still birding. You're ready.
And we went home and found,
Okay, follow me.
this direction.
Okay, this is the Mitchell Mausoleum. It's the only private one that's in Hillside Cemetery. The Mitchells came from Chicago in 1886 part of a group of people called the Chicago Colony. And they settled in what is East Redlands. And so the names that they brought from Chicago are still with us today. Wabash, Dearborn, LaSalle, Lincoln, Indiana Street that was in between there. And then of course, what's that great street that's in downtown Chicago? State Street. So they were the ones that were influential to get State Street with the downtown of Redlands. Of course, it's a dead-end street. But it's our main street in Redlands, of course, the downtown area. Anyway, the Mitchells, being from Chicago, had come from New Orleans. And this is what you do in New Orleans, because you're in a city built below sea level in the Mississippi River, and all the burials are above ground. Unless you want to wait for the flood and see the casket come bobbing up out of the ground and then float down the Mississippi out to the Gulf of Mexico, you got to go above ground. Well, the nice thing about a burial site like this is somebody dies in your family and they go on the top shelf, okay? And then as your body falls apart and becomes bones, it falls down, you can shake it, and then that space is open for the next person in your family. So in New Orleans, they've been burying people since the 1600s. There's 200 to 300 people in some of the crypts that they have there, and they have plenty of room. Because as I said, the next thing after the bones, you become dust. And so needless to say, they have the names of all the people buried on the outside. And then if there's several people who have died in your family in a short time, they put you in the walls of the cemetery until there's space in your crypt again, and then you go on the top shelf. So being on the top shelf, you know, you're in the place of honor, but you're soon going to be replaced by the next person who comes along. But once again, this is expensive, and this is granite, polished granite. And so how many spaces did they have to buy in this? Well, they were only $10 a piece back then, so they probably have like 10 or 12 here, but they have their whole family buried here, and they can go on really forever. And the nice thing about this is that unlike that building that's hard to maintain, solid rock isn't going anywhere, and of course the doors are all iron. So cemetery from here straight down following Alessandro. And in 1890, Alessandro Road was built by Native Americans, 50 Serrano Native Americans, built up this, then went down the road here to Santa Mateo Canyon, then up to Redlands Boulevard, and then met a gang of 50 men coming the other direction, and they joined together because Frank Brown had finished developing Redlands, and he was off to Moreno Valley and San Jacinto and Alessandro developing that. So Native Americans built this road, and then the other gang of laborers came and met them in between. Also Native Americans, if you're going from the hospital down Winery Grade or West Fern Avenue, that's also built by Native Americans. Okay, curbs and gutters in Redlands, many of them were built by Native Americans. They were hired by Judson Brown. They had a village site right where good old Stater Brothers is at Barton and Alabama Street. Photographs of them with their village site that was there, and they generally got paid 50 cents a day for work. Chinese were paid $1 a day for work, but the Chinese were very ambitious workers. They'd start up at sunup and they would stop about noon, make a small fire, warm up some rice, eat for 20 minutes, and they're back to work until the sun goes down. And you didn't have to have anybody managing them. They would do all that from sunup to sundown, day after day, and then of course take Sunday off. But Saturday evening, they would gamble everything they made away. So everybody has vices, right? And they would pay Fan Tan on Oriental Avenue in Redlands. There was a Chinese town that was there. No Chinese are buried here in this site. California had a law in 1855. Chinese could not attend public schools. nor could Native Americans. The Redlands School District did not enforce that law, and nobody from the state ever came around to check to see if we had Indians that were in classes and stuff, so no one worried about it. But it was a law passed in 1855 that showed that. Now, the cemetery also has certain areas for ethnic groups, and I'll point those out as we go. Is it discrimination? To some degree it was at the time, but mostly it was based on economics. If you were on the ridges here, as time went on, the city in 1918 started charging more for the higher ridges, and if you're in the valleys, it was less. It's all about location, location, location. And a place with a view charges more, even like you can see anything. All right, let's go back here. My etiquette for walking from graveyard is I try not to walk on tombstones because your walking can scratch their names, so just walk around the gravestone. The grass doesn't care, the guys down below don't mind either.
Hey, I want to go with my jacket. Huh? No jacket, did it?
So, here's a gentleman who gave the city a cemetery in 1886 and had to pay to get buried here. Saved 23 acres and then had to pay for the plots here. So this is Edward Judson. He was educated in Amherst and he came to the Lagonia in 1876 and eventually had the Redlands subdivision with his co-founder Frank Brown, and then became the first mayor of Redlands. I don't know how many developers you know stick around after they found a community to become the mayor, but he is one of those that did that. He's very much interested in creating flora and fauna that was like Connecticut. So we have incense cedar here from the San Bernardino Mountains. We have Theodore fir from the Himalayas. We have Italian cypress. In fact, the Italian cypress here, according to Paul Allen, who was the park commissioner for years, that this is the greatest concentration of Italian cypress outside of Rome. So that's a lot of Italian cypress. Doesn't need a lot of water and stuff. And we also have the incense cedar are from San Bernardino Mountain. Here gives us redwoods, and all those trees do very well in redwoods. You would think that a redwood has to be a giant sequoia would only last in Big Sur somewhere else. Plant it in Redlands, water it, and it'll grow. They like the heat, in fact, unlike myself. Okay. I'm going to show you one grave down here. Frank Brown's son, who was born in Big Bear in 1884 when his dad was building the Big Bear Dam, which is essentially Redlands reservoir for our irrigation water. He died in 1968, the year I graduated from high school, 50 years ago. And so, born in 1884, died in 1968. He was a lawyer. His name is Edward Judson Brown. So, you could say that Judson and Brown had more than a partnership. They had a life connection. So Edward Judson Brown is named after Edward Judson, the other co-founder. We're in the Yucaipa section. Atwood, In 1882, Leon Atwood built Casablanca. It's the oldest structure in Yucaipa. If you're going up to Oakland, and you're going up Oakland Road, past Stater Brothers, about 2 miles on the left, you'll see a sign that says Casablanca, Leon Atwood. They have a gate across it so you can't go in there as a tourista, but they built that in 1882. And he started what is called cherry croft, growing all kinds of cherries and apple trees and everything else. And then in 1908, 1909, 1910, 2 Redlands developers, Andrew Dyke and John Logie, formed a partnership of Dyke and Logie, and they sold Yucaipa land down on Orange Street as realtors. So Yucaipa is just an annex of Redlands, folks. In fact, Yucaipa Boulevard and the names of all the streets are all given by Dyke and Logie Real Estate. And so this is, as I said, this section here is all Oakland and Yucaipa folks because they didn't have a cemetery. Let's go here.
Do you want to put the
Yeah, that would be really nice. I should have made it in my pocket. Don't be planted by that. Lion and Sons had 2 packing houses in Redlands, and they got very wealthy packing oranges. And Lion donated money to AK Smiley Library, and if you're ever in the assembly room, you're in the Lion wing of AK Smiley Library. All the parts of the library except for the Heritage Room are all donated by philanthropists in Redlands over the years. But in 1988, the city of Redlands put in $5 million for our 100th anniversary to build the Heritage Room. And that's the only part of the library that citizens' taxes were used to construct it. Most people now, well, they're starting to allow some of these again if you've got the money to buy them. But for the most part, most tombstones are flat so that they can mow over the top of them. And they get county prisoners that operate the mowers and stuff to come in here. And this is a difficult section to mow because you got to dodge all these suckers. You run into one of these and it's over, okay? So most cemeteries are really plain, no trees, no nothing, because they wanted to go in and just mow and be done with it. You have to keep maneuvering all around these headstones is really a difficult project. How many of you have eaten at Joe Greensleeves? Here's Mr. Finney. Dr. Finney block there. Mr. Finney built that block downtown North through. And Greensleeves put in all kinds of new ironwork so that it has a sun-reinforced brick. And so it would meet earthquake standards, and now it does. And Mr. Finney was a banker in Redlands, and he built 4 buildings in downtown Redlands, and all 4 of them are still standing. All are red brick, all built in the 1890s, which is amazing. And then Mr. Heising probably built a couple thousand homes in Redlands. Garrett Heising came to Redlands with tuberculosis. They thought he'd die within a year, and he didn't. He lasted till I think it's 1945 or so. And after he recovered his health, he went up and climbed Mount San Gregonio and stood up on the monument there and did a Statue of Liberty pose. Got his photograph taken, then came down, and by 1904 he started building homes. His most famous homes are the California bungalows that are on the 500 block of Eureka Street. They qualify for the National Register, but they are an historic district in Redlands. If you've never been to the 500 block, it's well worthwhile to look at them. He was a frustrated contractor. He really wanted to be a landscape architect. And so when he sold you land or a house, he did all of the landscaping because he said you'd muck it up. And it's quite true. Buena Vista Street doesn't have a variety of trees going up and down it. They're all oak trees. He planted them all, okay? Plus, he, as I said, he landscaped for each home and put in the plants that would be appropriate for that house. Depending on the size and the width of the street and everything else, he was really thinking about it for a long time, what streets would look like and stuff. Every one of his streets that he built on, he made sure that a street tree theme was followed from one end of the street to the other so that everything would match. Very nice. So Redlands isn't pretty by chance, it's guys like him. Was a German immigrant along with his wife, and they immigrated to California, and they were never able to build the house they wanted until later in life. So in 1901, they built a house right across from where it's now Girard's, the Holston House, right on would be the southeast corner of Center and Cypress. It's still there. Got a new carriage barn too.
Yeah.
This is man from Trinity owned that house.
I would drive up the street to my grandma's house.
About where you were.
Oh.
So, if you're in the funeral business, where do you want to have your burial take place? How about at the entrance of the driveway of Hillside Cemetery? So, Rohrer, Ralph Rohrer was a furniture salesman, but furniture people also built caskets. And so, when business wasn't dropping like it should, they're selling, they're selling other kinds of furniture. He teamed up with the Courtner family, and in 1906 they built the building that's on the corner of Cajon and East Olive, which is now an insurance building. It was the YWCA for years, starting in 1913, okay? But that is a funeral chapel for Courtner and Rohrer. I have a picture of a ambulance. They didn't call them hearse back then. They called them an ambulance. You weren't dead because you're just moving around, okay? So needless to say, Rohrer put his name here. You can't miss it as you come into the cemetery. It's right here near the entrance. It was a way that, of course, to advertise. He went out of the funeral business, stayed in the furniture business, moved on West State Street, and Courtners took over, and then they abandoned the building they were in 1909, built a new funeral chapel on the corner of 6th and East Olive. It's still there too. It's today it's a dentist's office, and eye examinations can be done there as well. And you go in, you're sitting in the viewing area for the caskets. Same thing when you go in the office of Cutler's Insurance. You walk in the office area, there's a two-way side because the casket would be on one side and the viewing area here to the casket, and the family be on the other side so you couldn't see them. So they could cry, you know, with a little bit of dignity and stuff. But we have funeral chapels all over Redlands that haven't been torn down. In fact, the Nordina Hospital, go a block in any direction and there's a funeral chapel, which is not a very good recommendation for the hospital. But then you can move the person down who died on a gurney at night and save the ambulance moving fee. I mean, money's money, so. All right, so I want you to notice here something, that the granite that's in the drive here, 8-9 foot long, one solid piece decorated at the top, and that goes down about another 12 inches.
Wow.
So each one of these pieces here
Wow.
is, and where'd they get it? From the Santa Ana Wash, good old Wash, Mill Creek and Santa Ana Wash, and did the cutting out there. And of course, they're just using hammers and chisels. And of course, when you look at a piece of granite, a rock, where do you begin to get this? So the masons that are doing this are some of the same masons that built the Bear Valley Dam, and they knew where to hit those rocks. And I mean, other than a little indentation here, they're pretty good. And look at how smooth they are on the top. Once again, no electric tools or anything like that as they're doing all this. All the drives here were all surveyed and laid out by Willard Chamblin, who was a civil engineer, and J.S. Edwards, who was in charge of the cemetery for years. They laid out all of the drives that are currently in the cemetery. Okay. So, going down right in here, I want you to be able to see the wall here. The wall was built by the Friends of Hillside Cemetery, and the plaques on there are various groups that have given money to the Friends of Hillside Cemetery over the years. You'll see Redlands Area Historical Society, although for this particular group, Steve and I are probably going to Las Vegas and enjoying. No, we get a lot of money with 4th grade tours for Redlands, and we give AK Smiley Library Heritage Room, and we haven't given a huge chunk of money yet to the Museum Association, but we plan to someday. We'll probably be one of the organizations that is a fundraiser constantly for the museum. Right now, they're a little out of our ballpark because they need $7 million, and I'm just fresh out of millions. Anyway, this group has been doing good things that were helping preserve the park. The main person who was in charge was Dr. Hill, and when he died, he passed it over to Bill Cunningham. And Bill Cunningham is 90 something, so but we do have $15,000 in that account, and we are looking to replace the chandelier that was in the original 1928 building. We've had a number of other major gifts to Hillside Cemetery. The Stokes Gate back here, the stone for that came from New York. It was finished in New York and shipped back with numbered pieces and put back together. And the Stokes family, Olivia and Caroline Stokes, built a palatial mansion in Redlands on what street? Mariposa. Oh, Mariposa. Now that home is owned by Brett Waterman, and he's redoing it inside and out. He does the program of Restored Redlands, and so he's restoring that house among those other projects. anyway, the Stokes were, when they came to Redlands, they traveled in their palatial private railroad car. Traveled extensively Santa Fe, but they had their own railroad car, so they traveled in style. When they died, they both left $10,000 to the YWCA in Redlands, $10,000 to AK Smiley Library, $10,000 to the Boys and Girls Club, $10,000 or $100,000 to Tuskegee Institute. But one of the things they did constantly was give gifts to cemeteries and colleges, entrance gates like this one here. And so their home on Mariposa cost $60,000, and that's in 1908, folks. $60,000 would have built you 10 homes in Redlands at that time. Anywhere in Highland Avenue at that time for $8,000. J. Fairchild was the builder. All of the furniture came from New York in their private railroad car. Caroline died before Olivia, and Olivia then gave Caroline Park to the city of Redlands. And that's the El Natural Park from all the way from Sunset that comes down, and we only allow native plants to grow there. They made their money in real estate, copper, mining, publishing, banking, and let's see, $10,000 to U of R, $5,000 to AK Smiley Library, in addition to the $10,000 given when Caroline died, $5,000 to Colored Orphanage in Riverside, and as I said, $125,000 to Tuskegee Institute. They have a special burial site in Redlands, which if we have time we'll go to. Needless to say, that one was given to remember Caroline. Then when Olivia died, she left in the will for the gate that's up there by the office entrance, which matches this gate. She gave additional money to match this gate on her death. So, and of course, their gravestone says, "To the city which we have adopted and loved in our remaining years, we wish it to stay true to its sense of history," which I think they pretty much have done. The Alessandro Street walls that are out here, CCC during the Great Depression, 5,000 feet of cobblestone walls. It's amazing that there's any rocks left in Mentone, because they brought them over here and then they cut them and split them in half, and so you only see the rounded side. The flat side is up against in the concrete. And then other walls that are in the park as well. They had 125 civilian conservation corps workers up here in the cemetery for 6 months, and they were down here. They went to Sunset and put the walls on Sunset, and then built Panorama Point and all that section in there. What we need in this country is a good depression to get all this civil work done. That's to do the improvements and stuff.
That's wishful thinking.
Yes, wishful. All right, so let's go and see David and Sarah Morey's grave site. Follow me. Watch out for traffic.
How about the cut stone curbs here?
Here, they're all 1890s. This is a log representing woodmen of the world of fraternal society. Men are always forming fraternal societies before the 1900s. They were kind of like secret, but everybody knew about them. And Knights of Pythias were those who belonged to a group that said, let's bury the hatchet and forget about arguing about the Civil War. And then International Order of Oddfellows, IOOF. You'll sign that. If you drive across Kansas, every town has an IOOF facility, okay? And there's also patrons of the husbandry, all kinds of things, and they all have symbols for the graves, showing they're united. one Vincent Seer that died. There's a star on this gravestone, and with the letters GAR, that's Grand Army of the Republic, the Union soldiers' burial, and they had a club in Redlands called the Bear Valley Grand Army of the Republic Stake. And the last one died off in 1935, but they met regularly and always were at Veterans Days. Anytime presidents visited Redlands, like McKinley and Roosevelt and Taft, they were always up front to be recognized by the president. Of course, McKinley was also in the Civil War, so he said some very nice words to them. So if you've been to the Maury House in Redlands, this is David and Sarah Maury. They came to California in 1852 looking for gold, didn't find it. Came to Brookside Avenue in 1882. He was a shipbuilder by trade. His wife started a nursery and had planted 20,000 little navel orange trees. She sold most of those navel trees to Riverside because they were in demand in Riverside. But she sold the first trees that were planted in Redlands to 3 different 5-acre plantations, and she sold them for $1 a piece. That $20,000 paid for the building of the Maury House. Of course, David Maury did most of the work. Seymour Brothers Planing Mill did all the woodwork and all the fancy stick work that's on the outside of the house. They had no plan. They simply got out in the front in the dirt with sticks, and David Maury drew what he wanted the house to look like when it was done. And voila, it was done. And then of course he worked on it his whole life, and if you go inside the house, you'll see orange blossoms and leaves that are orange trees all throughout the first story. They're all over the place. Even on the stairway going up, you'll see all kinds of work that he did. He would take a piece of oak without any nails, cut out the whole thing, and make a bookshelf. So he was really quite skilled. But he also helped in the development of Redlands because he figured out how to build the Big Bear Dam using cut stone like this you see right here, and how to lift it and set it into place on the dam. Since he was a shipbuilder, he knew how to move heavy objects. And so he helped Frank Brown with all the derricks and everything, other things they needed to build the dam. And for that, he got 4 shares of Bear Valley Water Company stock, which at the time was worth $5 a share, but within a year it was worth $125 a share. So he was paid off very well for his work. When he built the Maury House in 1890, he didn't plant citrus, he planted 1,600 grapefruit trees, okay? When Sarah died, he went into depression. They had never had children, so he was living in that big old house by himself. He went down to the Coronado Hotel and went up to the 5th floor, and in room 1313 committed suicide. They won't tell you that at the Coronado Hotel. They don't advertise. You want to go to the suicide room? No.
They don't have a
Anyway, they're both buried here, and of course this stone represents the stones that were used in the building of the Big Bear Dam. When he sold his house, he sold it to Willard Cheney in 1905, and there have been a number of owners in the house since then. And of course, within the last 10 years, it's been completely rehabbed back to almost its original. The painting on it is very much original. People did not paint white in 1890. You're building a Victorian house, you're saying, look at me, I've made it. And so it has all those particulars with it. Okay, let's go this direction.
Just looking for headstones.
It's a heck of a stone.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the Farquhars? Farquhars came to Redlands in 1889, and they're still selling oranges on the corner of Wabash and 5th, right across from the Mormon church. And so they get those Mormons as they come out of church on Sunday and sell them oranges. Samuel Hayes came to Redlands in 1882, built a house in 1883, had to have the wood shipped in from the San Jacinto Mountains because we had no lumber here in Redlands, because Redlands had no downtown, no businesses, no nothing, okay? This house was on West Cypress Avenue. We have pictures of it. It was torn down in 1953. Really a classic Victorian house at the time. His expertise was hotels, and so he was at one time the manager of the Terracina Hotel, the Windsor Hotel, the Terrace Villa Hotel, the Sunnyside Inn. If there was a hotel, he taught everybody how to manage it. And usually he was working for that hotel for 1 or 2 years, and then would turn it over to somebody else when he got it really going really well. Hotels in Redlands did really well because we became a tourist town. Because, I don't know if you noticed, but from October all the way until May, the weather in Redlands is very nice. Here it is, October 20th, short sleeves, shorts, and it was 90 something today. Oh my God, this is fall, okay? And a really nice day, nice clouds here for the effects and stuff. Okay, this corner over here are all jewelers. All the jewelers got together and had their own little area. So Israel Beale came to Ligonia in 1870. He was a slave in Virginia until 1865 when a cavalry group freed him. He joined the Union Army, fought the last 6 months in the Civil War, was part of the ceremony in Washington, D.C. celebrating the victory of the Union forces during the Civil War. He migrated to California, went to Northern California and looked for gold, didn't find any. Made it to Los Angeles by 1869, and then finally San Bernardino Valley by 1870. He teamed up with a man from Kansas, a devoted Democrat, pro-Civil War Confederate, and they became partners. Here is a freed slave, and here is a pro-Confederate farm partnership. They grew corn out in Crafton for 2 years, made enough money, went back to Ligonia on Pioneer Street, right where Israel Beale Park is today, and planted orange trees. And then of course he was in the house moving business, He dug ditches. He did everything. He was a contractor of sorts, and also was in the Ligonia fruit packing business. He had heavy freight wagons so he could move houses, and he could also move fruit and stuff. He didn't have a tombstone, so in 1995, the Redlands Area Historical Society gave him a proper burial. And then here's his 3 children right here. They're all Beale children, all next to him here. He married Martha Embers, who came to San Bernardino in 1855 in a covered wagon from Salt Lake with the Mormons. And so when she arrived in California, California was a free state. She was free. California is a free state at the time. Behind us is Veterans Circle. If you walk out there in a circle, you'll see World War I, World War II, Spanish-American War veterans, names on the tombstones. And here's the other co-founder of Redlands, Frank Elwood Brown, died in 1914, born in 1856. Next to his first daughter, Emmeline Brown Hopkins, she died in 1962. And this Anita Brown Phelps always drove me crazy. Who the heck is that? Because I knew all the 8 children that Frank Brown had, and then I discovered there's the black sheep in the family. And Brainerd Brown was Frank Brown's brother. He had an affair in Redlands, and she is the affair result. And he raised her as his daughter, and so when she died, she's buried next to Frank Brown as well. And Rebecca Brown is Frank Brown's sister, and Minnie Brown is another sister, and then Denton Johnson, Frank Brown, was his brother-in-law. He set him up with a store and a post office in Ligonia in 1882. So early history said that Frank Brown was such a pauper at the end of his life that he had to be buried in the Johnson family plot. Pooey on that, he bought 19 plots in 1889, and they're all buried in the Frank Brown section. Okay? And so, and he wasn't a pauper when he died. He lived in Los Angeles at the time. He developed Brownlands and Nuevo and Hemet, Lodge area, Hemet area. He owned 18,000 acres in the San Jacinto Valley. I'd say that's not a pauper. So. Okay, out here on the end we have Myron Crafts, who until all these trees grew, had a beautiful view of Redlands. So Myron Crafts died September 12, 1886, and he's the reason that Judson Brown donated the land for the cemetery. And then one of his sons, he's a Republican back when it wasn't very accommodating to be a Republican. He was also a prohibitionist and an abolitionist. And so his store was burned down once in Michigan and once in Altoona, Pennsylvania. So when he came to Crafton, it was to get out of the way of the Civil War and the animosity that the war was causing. He named one of his sons Lincoln. He named the Crafton Peak Zaha and then there's Lincoln, and I can't remember the other name of the peak. They named all the Crafton Hills. Of course, Crafton College is named for the name, and East Redlands is really called Crafton and stuff. And then Eliza Crafts is buried, she's also buried here. And the Crafts family were intermarried with several other Crafton families, and they're all buried in this area here. Scipio Craig, owner of the Citrograph newspaper, is right somewhere along here. That newspaper started in 18. Is that it right there? Your Craig? Yeah. It started, he died in 1908, and when he died, the paper died. So it went from 1887 to 1908. It was a weekly printed on bookbinding paper. So it is as good as his first copy said, this is going to be the history of Redlands, and I wanted it to be preserved, so I'm not putting it on regular newspaper print. And it's all bound. There's 2 different copies of the Case Motley Library. If you've never looked at it, go through it, just turn the pages, and it's enlightening, because he writes about all the things happening in Redlands at the time.
It's interesting that some of these only have like died and then
Yes.
the year, not
Well, not the date of birth.
not the whole picture.
How important is your date of birth?
If it hadn't happened, there
Well, the
wouldn't be
family
that.
knows.
Yeah.
The family knows. And we all get to die too. So sometimes just the date is all that people ask for. He never had any children. He had 2 wives, and the second wife was a feminist and wrote all kinds of columns and Citrograph. It was way ahead of its time. Where the Redlands City Facts was a prohibition paper, he he died of cirrhosis of the liver, so that should tell you. He liked wine, okay? So the 2 papers fought against each other on a regular basis. He was also Republican, but on prohibition he thought that Redlands was losing its shirt because people were still drinking and the city wasn't making any profits on it. And it's kind of crazy to be a prohibition city because University of Redlands had a winery and 3 80-acre vineyards. Barton had 80 acres in a vineyard. Lachey's down in San Francisco Canyon had a 120-acre vineyard. You got all this wine all around here. They're producing wine and brandy. And you're trying to be a prohibition. Good luck on that. And you got all these people working in the orange fields every day, and they're thirsty. Okay, let's get down to the road.
I think so.
Careful here. Yep. Thank you.
Really old section there.
Yes, it is.
Benjamin Franklin Waterous has the tallest spire in the cemetery. He was in the Grand Army of the Republic, and he was at Shiloh, Gettysburg, and what's the name of that battle? Petersburg. And he was a surgeon. So guess what he did? He cut off arms and legs for 3 or 4 days after every battle. And when he came to Redlands in 1881, he bought 10 acres of land on corner of Cajon and East Olive, and he subdivided it, and he wouldn't practice medicine any longer. He hauled freight up to the building of the Big Bear Dam in 1883 and 1884. Started a resort called Bluff Lake, which is still up there. Now it's part of the Conservancy Group. Beautiful area, right on Bear Valley Ridge, about 7,800 feet in elevation. Watrous, when he subdivided, he named the streets Nordina, Myrtle, and Sonora, because he first came to California, went to Sonora, and Myrtle is the name of his wife, and Nordina is the name of his daughter. So that's how the street name. So the first block from East Olive going south, all those homes are 1890s. The second subdivision that goes from Clark up, those are early 1900s. That's a different subdivision. But anyway, he died in 1896. He was the president of the Grand Army of the Republic, so that's how he gets the big spire, the tallest spire in the cemetery. This road here is being readapted and lawned in, and if you'd like to be buried in the old section, this is now going to be made available. Okay, so on the end here we have Jasper Newton Field, who started a little thing called the University of Redlands. Homer Kingsbury is buried right on the corner. He was the mayor of Redlands. He also held the record for walking from Summit Avenue to Big Bear, 21 miles in 4 hours and 25 minutes. What? Walking. Well, he didn't walk, he ran. Now, at the end, he had to go up Big Bear Ridge. He went up Santa Ana Canyon, bushwhacking as he went, and then finally up and over and down into Pine Knot, as it was called at the time. Homer Kingsbury, dad, was Reverend Kingsbury, who started, he was on the school board for Redlands School District in 1884, and then they built the Redlands School in 1888, and they named it Kingsbury. It's there today. So Homer Kingsbury also started a marmalade factory, jams, jellies, unadulterated lemon juice, and was one of the founders of the University Club. The University Clubhouse is on the corner of Cajon and East Fern. Big 2-story building. Now it's apartments, but it was University Clubhouse. Built in 1902, a gift of Alfred Cameron Burridge to the men of Redlands who were college graduates, so they could go someplace and talk about other things other than orange trees, furrows, fertilizer, and other kinds of things. Also buried down here, William Graff Moore, Civil War veteran, Frank and Bill Moore, who were owners and editors of the Redlands Daily Facts for decades. Moore Junior High is named after the family, and Frank and Bill are known for the grain of salt column that they had in Redlands, which talked about the history of Redlands on a daily basis. It was an independent Republican paper, but in the 1890s became Prohibition, and Bill Moore was a GOP captain for Southern California. He took around Earl Warren when he was running for governor, Richard Nixon when he was running for Senate, and of course they formed the Moore Historical Foundation and printed 7 different books on Redlands history, which is a big deal. Also, the multimillionaires are buried on the end here, and they are Newton Maccabee, who had a patent on caskets for the whole United States.
Oh my.
And he built a house on West Crescent Avenue. It's still there today. The Reynolds family lives in it, but Newton Maccabee's 1891 house is in between the Burridge Mansion on one side and Smiley Park on the other side. John Fisher is buried there, along with his dad, Henry Fisher. Henry Fisher started the Fisher Oil Company. It's the oldest oil company in the United States. They sold to John D. Rockefeller for a couple $1 million, back when $1 million was real money. Okay, they came to Redlands in the 1890s for the health of Henry Fisher's wife, and she subsequently died, and he remarried. And when he remarried, he married a woman who was 40 years younger than him, which raised the eyebrows of Victorian Redlands. In fact, Eyes the World, written by Harold Bell Wright, suggests that that was not a good thing to do in terms of Victorian Redlands. But Henry Fisher started, he electrified the Redlands railway system. We had 2 mules pulling around a car. They started in 1893. John and Henry started, along with Henry Sinclair, started Redlands Electric Light and Power Company. First 3-phase power plant in the United States of America. It started right here in Mill Creek Canyon, bringing electricity to Redlands, and later on 83-mile transmission line to Los Angeles to run their electric streetcars. Then John Fisher started Southern California Edison Company, Lila Creek Light and Power Company, and John Fisher hired, he became the business manager of Cecil B. DeMille. Maybe you've heard that name. Where they did little movies like The Bible and all kinds of other kinds of things. And they did movies in Big Bear in 1914 at Fisher Point, and they built the airport up in Big Bear at that time so that they could fly in and fly out. John Fisher sold the last interest he had in the Fisher Oil Company. He had 2 houses in Redlands. His first and second house are still standing. One is on the corner of West Crescent and Center Street, and it looks like a Greek Revival home. It's facing south. It could have been a plantation with slaves out picking cotton in it, because it looks like that. Built in 1895, and then he built a modern house on West Highland Avenue. If you're on San Mateo and you come up to Highland, look straight up. You're looking at the Fisher house. Okay, that was his second house. Okay, and then later on he moved to Los Angeles as his interests grew. And let's see. Let's go see Will Fowler. I'm moving slow because my hips are killing me. Yes, when you're 68, you need a new tire. So John Hosking and his family came to Redlands in 1882 with the Morys, and they bought 20 acres down on Brookside Avenue, and he built a house there. In fact, right where Courtner's is today, he built a house. And as his house is under construction, he goes to Frank Brown, who's naming the streets at the time, and he says, "I want you to call this street Eureka Street." And Frank Brown says, "Why?" He says, "Well, because I'm from Northern California, and I was the manager of the Eureka Mills mine. And I was in that mine for years and years. I want my street to be called Eureka Street." It's Eureka Street today. And of course, most of the other streets in Redlands that run north-south have Spanish names like San Mateo, Alvarado, Buena Vista, Cajon, because that was their theme. So Eureka kind of breaks the theme a little bit. But that's okay, because it's historical. Eureka Mills Mines. Everybody used to think, "Oh, Eureka, I found it, it's California." That's a different place.
It's water?
Oh, no, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay.
You can tell there's 6 other roads to drive down.
Man, big place.
Occupy Redlands. up to that end, when you open up the back of the box, it's right there. Will Fowler was in the Civil War. He enlisted in 1860, got married, and had a son. And his son is buried here in front, born in 1875, so he was a quick worker. As a 15-year-old, by the time the war was over, he's 19 and moved up to be a colonel. So George Custer, take a stand in the back row because he did very, very well. But then he fought Native Americans in the Sioux Wars in the late 1870s, and then was the mayor of Redlands. So he had quite a career. All right, come on up here.
Look at Cap.
Well, there's one of those Jacenos who got out of his trap. They're supposed to be over there with the Portuguese.
Tom, is that Tim's family, the Rexford?
No, I don't think so. So one of the most famous people buried in Redlands is Dr. Jacob D.B. Stillman. And in 1882, he bought land where the University of Redlands is and put in 3 80-acre vineyards, one for wine, one for grapes, and one for brandy. It did very well, put in a winery, and in 1888 was chosen to be the chair of the committee to incorporate Redlands. That was a smart choice by Judson Brown because he was well known. He wrote books. In Search of the Golden Fleece was a book he printed about his search for gold in Sacramento in the 1850s and about his trip coming west by ship around the Horn. He also wrote for several magazines and about travels in Texas and Arizona and the Southwest. So he was very popular. He was a rock star when he came to this area. Everybody else is unknown. He's a college graduate and a doctor and the personal physician of Leland Stanford, who at the time was the governor of California and also the president of the Southern Pacific Railroad. Maybe you've heard of them. Needless to say, his death in 1888 before incorporation was a bit of a blow, but he had done enough to say, look, if we incorporate, let's make sure that we have 3 people that represent Livonia and maybe only 2 that are from the Redlands side of the tracks. And so they did that and helped keep a balance in the city as things got started. Of course, his land later on is purchased by the Baptist Church and becomes the University of Redlands today. In fact, where the administration building is today was his house. Okay, his house was built there in 1883. It was a large, very large house. He got water out of the Mill Creek Zaha he had a water wheel on the Zaha, and as it turned, it pulled a string that carried up cups of water to the attic, which dumped into a reservoir, and gravity flowed through the rest of the house. He had another water wheel that took water from Mill Creek Zaha that went to the winery that was used in the making of wine and cleaning and everything else. So he had a very unique water system out of Mill Creek Zaha at the time. At one time, the Zaha went in front of the Greek theater, around in front of the stage. It was so loud that they moved it behind the stage because you couldn't hear the actors on the stage because the water was rushing so wildly that it made a racket, so they moved it to the back end and stuff. Anyway, he was quite, as I said, one of the first people was important. The other three people I didn't take you to, that they're into that long loop that we're on, is the Nordoff family. Charles Nordoff, Walter Nordoff, and Charles Nordoff. Charles Nordoff wrote with a co-author 3 books, a trilogy. Men Against the Sea, Pitcairn's Island, and Mutiny on the Bounty, which was turned into a movie, okay? But those 3 books were really, really popular. And if we get requests for disinterment to move people to other areas, Tahiti wants the Nordoffs, all of them, because they're all writers and all wrote about Pacific and stuff. They lived in Redlands on the corner of Pacific and Cedar. Their house is still there. They had another business down in Mexico that made tile, but they're also writers. Here it is, they live in Redlands, California, and they write about the Pacific Ocean and the British ships and Mutiny on the Bounty and Breadfruit and, you know, Christian and the whole cast of characters are out on the ocean. It's amazing. So you can see why Tahiti would like to have them. At one time, there was a town in Northern California called Nordoff. When World War I came along, anything German was taboo. We even stopped teaching German at Redlands High School for a while. And so Nordoff today is called Ojai. And it's still Ojai to this day, but it was originally Nordoff. So think of that as you're going through the town. So which family has had the greatest impact on Redlands history? No, I don't think so. So that family would be the Hinckleys, okay? The Hinckleys, okay? And now that I've got here, we're almost at the end, I want to announce that Monday we have a speaker, John Weeks. He's going to be talking about comparing Loma Linda, which is a city that has people who live to be 80, 90, and 100 years of age, with San Bernardino, the fast food city of the United States, where Tacotilla and McDonald's and other fast food industries all started. He has a book out, a real humorous comparison. He grew up in Loma Linda, and his great-great-grandmother was the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which of course founded Loma Linda in 1902. So that's a 7 o'clock program that'll be inside the Contemporary Clubhouse on 173 South Eureka Street. Also, if cemeteries infatuate you, we have a program working with Hillside Cemetery. Volunteers are putting together everything they have on their books, scanning it and making sure it going to go on internet. So if you'd like to volunteer, Steve Spiller here will take your name. He's the president of the Historical Society, and we'll turn your name over to the other volunteers. They only work an hour or so a day, 3 days a week, because they have to use the office computer, and that's so it's a very limited amount of time that they're working. But they're scanning all the information on 30,000 grave sites, and they're well on their way to getting it completed. Needless to say, the Hinckley family. Frank Hinckley came to Old San Bernardino between Redlands and Loma Linda in 1883. He was a civil engineer who laid out all the railroad tracks in Oakland for all the trains that came in to drop off the freight and stuff. Edith Parker Hinckley, who married George Hinckley, wrote the life of, who married Frank Hinckley, wrote about the history of the family up until that time. Edith Parker Hinckley also wrote Two Girls and a Kite, about her first trip on the Santa Fe coming to Redlands on the kite-shaped track and what it was like. She wrote for her, she was in her 80s, she wrote Crime and Scandal in Early Redlands. It's a kick to read, what considered scandal at the time. And then their son, Horace Hinckley, was the Bear Valley Mutual Water Company president. The Hinckley Water Plant is named for him. George Hinckley was city engineer for Redlands for years. Painted the first white line on Cajon Street on the curve so cars would stay on their rightful sides and not shortcut the intersection. And you laugh as you will, but in 1911 that was in Scientific Magazine at the time as being something that was right on the heel of keeping traffic moving. 1911, not too many cars though. Horace Hinckley was in charge of rebuilding the Assistencia in the 1930s, the House of Neighborly Service. Nat Hinckley and Seward Hinckley are both assemblymen representing this area at the state level. They had highway bills, Santa Ana watershed protection, education, and of course George was on city council in 1908. So the name Hinckley is on it because they've been there. They're really associated with lots of stuff in Redlands. Clock. Where's Clock? Oh, Wilsers. The Wilser family, of course, if you've ever been up to Riley's farm, you're on the Wilser Ranch. They settled up there in the 1870s and started growing apples. That'll never work out. But they started growing apples. Yes, it did work out. And in fact, in 1909, everybody in Yucaipa bought apple orchards because the sign said where the great big red apples grow. And that was good until the codling moth discovered them. And then they were too low of an elevation for apples to do well during the summertime. And so now nobody grows apples there at all. But it went to walnuts, peaches, plums, and apricots. Clock Auditorium. The Clock family had 3 brothers. They all lived on East Palm Avenue. They all had citrus groves. And he was a member of the school board for 35 years. And so when they built auditorium on the high school campus in 1928, he retired from the school board in 1933. They named the building Clock Auditorium in his honor. But there's one very strange thing about Clock Auditorium. You know what it is? There's no clock. No clock at all. Okay. Let's go this way. So, who is the first burial here? The cross is 2. Here's the first. So, Charles Gauthier, it says first Civil War veteran. That's not true. He's the first Civil War veteran. He's the first one buried here. But there are other people who died in the Civil War that were veterans too. Buried June 12, 1887. Of course, the tree wasn't that large at the time. In fact, there were no trees, there were no walkways, no drives, no nothing. It was just a bare hill up here. He's the first resident of Smiley Heights. Okay, Smiley Heights. Yes. Laugh as well. So to get water, he had to go down to the Milk Resaw and carry it up in barrels. And he was dying of tuberculosis. He was a minister during the Civil War, and ministers had it just as bad as the surgeons. They weren't cutting off the legs, but they were talking and burying all the people who died and saying words over each one of them. These soldiers were mostly good Christians, and when they died, they expected to have final words say over them. Well, when you get Gettysburg, we had 35,000 dead in 3 days. You're saying a lot of words for a long time. And can you tell really the difference between a Confederate soldier and a Union soldier? No, you're just doing it all. In fact, most of the soldiers buried at Gettysburg are all mixed up. You can't tell. And most of those graves, they have them as individuals out there, but really they're trenches and they're just bodies one after the other, because the battle took place on July 3rd and it was warm, it was hot, and the bodies were bloating within 2 days, and so you have to get them in the ground quickly or you're looking at all kinds of diseases and stuff. Okay, we have for sale in a box back there of my truck, if you're interested, a DVD that has biographies of a lot of people I talked about today. You can put it on your computer. It also has photographs of homes, and it's 97 pages long, but it's all in there. And there's a glossary to find stuff, and that's $10. And then we have the 125th anniversary of Redlands. That's got all kinds of photographs and biography or histories of homes in Redlands, and that's $15. And then Souvenir of Redlands was printed in 1898 and 1903. We put it all together in one, updated all the information on the homes, and told you where they are. The addresses are all current, so you wouldn't get lost. And that's $20. So 20, 15, and 10. And I'd shake you down upside down, but this is hollow ground, so we don't do that. Anyway, thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. As I said, we have a program Monday. You're all welcome. It's all free. And then we have Eureka Street walking tour, or I'm sorry, Forest Street walking tours. Look for the newspaper, and if you got the Redlands Historical Society newsletter, it'll also be announced in the newsletter. It'll also be in the Redlands Daily Facts. So, and once again, join, and you're only $10. Don't join, you're $15. We're happy either way. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. It was great.
Yeah. Oh yes, Clive. Yeah, same family. Yeah. Oh yeah, he shouldn't have been in education. He ended up teaching in trauma. Had a job in trauma. He was also a doctor. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh yeah, yeah.
Now.
Class of '67 lost 3 that crashed into a wall. Yeah, they were in a sports car racing down the hill. So yeah. Was that mine? I'm 68. Yeah, I'm 54. Oh, then you're much younger than me. Yeah, yeah.
You mentioned Isaac, right?
Garrett Heisen.
Now, is he responsible for the redwood trees running north of the Seventh-day Adventist Church there too? It's in this neck of the woods, right?
Yes. That's north. Okay. Yes.
Right.
And we also have an app. It's called the Explore app. And so if you're sitting out in front of a house and want to know about that house and it has been recognized, you just open up the app and it'll show you the photograph.
Well, that's a great idea.
Yeah, if you can work your phone, it is.
Yeah.
There you go. There you go. Are you tracking? Which one? 10. Yes. You got it. It's good.
I need one of those too.
Yep, I didn't bring membership stuff, so I'm bad.
It's been bothering me. I've been in here since 50. And I know there was another mausoleum up there. And it was in 50. It was broken into, and some of the remains were cremated. And the devil worshippers down in Orange County at IUC Irvine and Back Bay, or whatever they do with them. And it was there in the corner. And it was tore down after that.
I never came across anything on it.
Let's see. It probably was right about 60. maybe 58.
It's basically inputting. It's
Because
basically inputting.
I haven't got that far in indexing newspapers, but I had done,
Yeah.
of course, all the early years and stuff.
I know it was in the San Bernardino paper, and surely it was in the facts.
Yeah,
I
it
don't
would have
know.
been in the facts.
I was living in San Bernardino at the time. My folks are here. We, in fact, we still have the house next door to Dr. Hine.
Yeah.
There on Walnut.
Oh, okay.
The city
Yes.
house is still there. And I call it the Stater Brothers house across the street.
The Kelly house.
Yeah, yeah.
And the pickup
Sold them.
in the commercial where they had the house for a little bit, they've used the pickup more.
Is that
But
right?
That's a pickup I drove working for Imperial Hardware from about 1949 through the mid-50s.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I had a friend, his mom worked at Imperial Hardware.
Oh, what's his name?
Last name was Armstrong. Louise Armstrong. She
Was
worked
it
there.
Louise Cook before?
No, I don't think she ever remarried. It was Armstrong. But she was there for a long, long time. She had a specialty on hardware, particularly, and for a woman, she knew her stuff.
That's strange,
Yeah.
because that's where my dad was. It's
Yeah,
hardware, and
yeah.
of course.
Well, we had that hardware
my
store,
girl
then of course we
is
had
Carlson.
Carlson's, and
Yeah.
they were competition for each other.
Oh, yeah.
When Imperial started, they drew a lot of business in all the way from Imperial Valley.
Oh yeah, well that's where the home was.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, in fact, the chairman at the time, H.P. Meyer, had a lot of right at the top of a Sunset.
Oh, is that right?
What's the main street that goes up to Sunset back in those days?
Garden?
Well, whatever it is through town, and you wind around and you get up right there on the left-hand side as you hit the top, at Sunset. He owned that lot for years. He never built on it.
Wow.
There was foundation work in there.
Yeah.
Thank goodness there's sense.
All right, well.
Good tour, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very
It's
much.
our second one here, and
Oh, is that right?
we always
Yeah.
find it more interesting.
Good.